So this is a legislative update. For those of you who may not have been following policy or aren't, government affairs nerds like Graham and I can be, there are a million and one laws that change, administrative regulations that change in any given year. And that's at the federal level, at the state level, in other states and in Texas, and then at the local level. And these policy changes can really have big impacts on the way that businesses operate, what kind of opportunities businesses have, the hurdles that are created for businesses and business owners. And having attended Dallas Startup Week for a long time, I had noticed that there was never really a substantive conversation about how all of these policy changes affect entrepreneurs. And so I wanted to bring in someone that advocates heavily for startups and for business owners. I'll let Graham give a little introduction about himself, but he has worked in a variety of capacities advocating for policy. I have a background, if you out there in attendance were unaware. In my prior life, I was Chief Legislative Counsel for a member of the U.S. House, and I handled intellectual property and emerging technology policy, along with some business policy, and also dealt with those topics in the state legislature. So this is a cause and a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I'm so thankful to Graham for joining us this morning, and I will give him a second to introduce himself, and then we will get started. And like I said, if you have questions that pop up throughout the course of the presentation, please post them in the chat, and we'll look over there periodically to try and incorporate and answer those questions throughout the course of the presentation. So with that being said, Graham, I will turn the presentation over to you to introduce yourself.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for having me here. It's great to be a part of this Dallas Startup Week. I attended last year, really enjoyed it. So yeah, I've been working in tech policy for about 5 years. Before that, I worked in politics. I've been in policy my whole life, but most recently, I worked for the advocacy group Engine Advocacy, which is really the premier startup sort of voice in government. So a lot of the stuff that I have for you today is taken from Engine, who really leads research in terms of what's happening on a day-to-day basis in DC. It's a free resource. If you have, if your business is facing some kind of a regulatory threat and you want to know how to get involved, I would first direct you there. I'll talk more about that as well. I'm always a resource, so I would encourage you, if any of you are interested in advocacy or just becoming more well-versed in the tech policy sphere, let me know. Before I was at Engine, I worked at Fiverr and Airbnb, and I worked in an advisory role with a lot of other startups, just doing sort of a variety of things. Now I'm doing a fellowship at the University of Massachusetts. That's where I am now in Amherst. I guess Amherst, no H. I'm still learning this region. But,
no one here was going to correct you, Graham. It's fine.
Yeah,
we won't tell anyone.
Good. So first couple things, like why it's important. I just want to, very basic level, advocacy is your policymakers and representatives, whether or not you have a relationship with them, are really working to try to help you succeed as a constituent who's creating economic impact in your region, who may create jobs down the line. But startups and entrepreneurship is really, did you guys lose me? There we go.
No,
startups and entrepreneurship is really critical to the economic fabric of any sort of region. So that's point A. There's a lot changing now, probably more rapidly than ever in history because of the rate of technological development. Of course, in Dallas, one of the leading innovative cities in the country, you're at the forefront of that. I think fortunately you have policymakers who are generally pretty well versed in the issues that at least are politically likely to be changed, since they do talk about how the process works for legislative change. It takes a long time, usually years in advance. You have multiple reiterations of a bill. If anything ever does happen, I mean, that's at the federal level. State level, things happen a little bit more quickly. Once something's on the agenda, it's more likely to eventually pass, just because states face less political gridlock. Not that they do still have quite a bit. So we'll talk about what's going on at the federal level, how we think about sort of policy for startups and entrepreneurs. When this is kind of the same format we would use in a legislative update meeting, which I wanted to sort of do, is we just have this very simple and very easy to follow, is that you have the document that has policy areas and then bullet points. So we'll talk about these. There should be some time at the end for questions. If anybody's got specific questions, especially, I would love to know what you're thinking of. And then Jessica, I'll turn to you for some of the state level stuff, especially here in Texas. And we'll have some good debate on some of these issues, which are more fun. So the first thing I really wanted to address, to get out of the way, I know that there are some attorneys with us. Intellectual property. I'm not an IP attorney. I'm not an attorney in any way. So nothing I say really, I'm just a policy kind of guru, I guess, wonk.
Wizard.
Wizard. Yeah, I like
wizard.
Wizard more
is
than
the verbiage we went with.
The first thing that's really on the slate now, this is big, and this probably affects just about every startup in some way. DMCA is the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It's under review. It's been going on for a while. The subcommittee that handles this issue has been interested in creating changes for some time. It's not clear how or if it will ultimately be changed, but the movement is gaining momentum in DC and also in Washington. So that's something you really be paying attention to. If DMCA, that's really known for the notice and takedown for copyright violations. So it's very specific if you're a platform and you have something, or if you really host any kind of web content, and you want to talk to your attorney about this, but if you host web content and you have copyrighted material, there's a procedure that's set by this law that mandates how you're supposed to go about taking it down, where the liability is placed, the amount of time you have to do it. All of those things are very important. And so whatever changes are made to this, even if they're minor, are going to create pretty substantial changes to the landscape that you have to adhere to as an entrepreneur. So if you're an operating tech platform, really something to be keeping track of. The CASE Act, that's something that's been going on. It kind of affects, it's about small claims copyright, creating a small claims court method. It's been disputed by startups who say they could lead to frivolous litigation because it makes it easier to sue companies. That's the big challenge. That said, it also has, it's been politically divisive. It's not likely to move forward at this point with COVID. It's been kind of delayed, but something to keep paying attention to. Patent quality issues, that's really sort of the first and foremost when we think about intellectual property as it relates to startups. There's not a lot of legislative change on the day-to-day, but it is a really active area because lawmakers want essentially constant and unending feedback on how startups, small companies, innovators are navigating the patent process. Patent trolls were a really big issue about 7 to 8 years ago. There was a decision called Alice, which if you're interested, you can look it up. I don't know the nuances of it, but basically changed the IP landscape, made it sort of more difficult to sue companies for patent infringement as frivolous. So that is, there have been a couple of bills introduced. One is the Stronger Patents Act, probably the most, let's talk slower, sure. Probably the most Stronger Patents. An early iteration of a bill that's not likely to move forward. At this point, discussion is still really important. So if this is something that you're really interested in, get involved because you're essentially shaping how the conversation, you may have a really big impact early on, so you could shape how things move, but not something that's going to change in the next year or two. The other big thing, this happened in China, and it's something that I've been following very closely. It's not clear how this is going to change American policymaking. It's very early, but there was a court case, TikTok versus Baidu, that admitted, basically they found through the use of blockchain data from Fatcom that a video had originated on the TikTok platform. And that was found on an early iteration of some Baidu experiment. Baidu is, just so you don't know, is a Chinese tech giant. And the court ultimately ruled in TikTok's favor as a result of the blockchain data. It's really the first time that sort of happened. Early indicator of what could come. Blockchain enthusiasts, you know that the policy landscape is really sort of unending out there. But looking forward to see what ramifications it has across the globe. Uh, so here, moving on to some key, anything else on IP? Okay. I'm going to move on to some platform issues. This is the
export restriction on some Chinese technology. So I will say, in relation to TikTok, because I'm assuming this is coming from the TikTok conversation, I think that and I anticipate Graham would second that there are going to be some interesting policy questions that emerge from the current executive policies regarding the use of TikTok and potential bans on TikTok, especially um, things to be mindful of. You know, at this point, the TikTok ban policy is so new and is such kind of a big departure from previous enactments that we've seen that I don't know that there's a lot tangibly to be garnered other than speculation at this point about potential impacts on that and export restrictions. So I'm not sure if you mean from China or from the United States, but you know, I think it's important to talk about the ban since we mentioned TikTok.
Yeah, yeah, the TikTok ban definitely substantial. We talk about that now. Crazy to see sort of a company being banned. It definitely the indicator of a new era. I mean, I think this is the indication of a new era of policymaking as it relates to China and sort of foreign data hosts.
And Trey, I think your question on the DMCA is a good one. So his question is essentially, you know, there have been a lot of companies that have not been subject to the DMCA for various reasons. So what do you anticipate? Do you anticipate that anything's going to change regarding that?
That is a very specific question.
A good question, Trey.
Yeah, Trey, I would encourage you to reach out to the policy council or IP council at Engine. She's probably the best person for you to talk to about that. Her name's Abby Reeves. I can follow up with you afterwards, and I'll send you more information.
And Trey,
that is very specific.
Yeah, and I will say, some DMCA policy when I worked on the Hill, and intellectual property is always going to pose a really big challenge for lawmakers because the policy positions of lawmakers don't tend to follow traditional party lines when it comes to intellectual property. It's very heavily dependent on the dominant industries in a given constituency. So you'll see, you know, cross-aisle conversations and collaborations, I think, more in intellectual property than you see in a lot of other areas. And I don't ever anticipate that anything related to IP, even the DMCA, but especially patent-related law, will ever move quickly in any direction for that reason. It's just hard to get kind of a consensus on any given thing because they can't rely on party lines.
Great. So platform issues. So what I mean by that, issues that relate to sort of technology platforms that have two sides. And the first one, the most important one, user-generated content, is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So Section 230 is an important law that basically protects platforms from liability over user-generated content. It has also specific interactions with all kinds of different laws. You'll have to talk to your lawyer about how it affects you, but this has been in the spotlight politically. Trump and Joe Biden both tweeted on the same day that they wanted to see it revoked. It has huge implications for large and small platforms alike. it's important to note that any kind of changes to 230 would also impact how we all interact with platforms like Google and the non-startup platforms. But also making smaller platforms liable would create a huge barrier to starting a business in technology, and basically you get sued. So that there was an executive order. I didn't read the specifics of it. Jessica, did you? Trump's executive order. Hello, Jessica. Am I frozen? Move back to that. Okay. So Trump had an executive order. He's going to keep. That's going to be an interesting area to watch, because I think what's going to happen is that they're going to be 230 is going to be siphoned off into different areas where it does and doesn't apply, and as it gets narrowed down, it's going to sort of eat away at the statute itself until eventually there's going to be a question about whether or not it makes any sense. And I mean, we're already at that point where politically, in the public sphere, we're discussing whether it makes any sense. But also changing it is such a huge thing that it's not clear what is going to happen in its place. Antitrust. Okay, this is a big one. The antitrust hearings. If you didn't watch it, definitely would encourage you to go back and watch it sometime if you're just hanging out. What a huge moment in history to have these 4 CEOs all there in a call with Congress. Really raised a number of important questions that affect small companies. That discussion wasn't really had at the hearing, so it's not clear where this is going to go. It really was kind of messy. So just some more background. There was a big hearing a couple months ago about maybe less than that even, I think July, about how the U.S. government should go about regulating big tech, essentially, because of its monopolistic capacity. And at this hearing, all kinds of things were brought up: data privacy, national security issues, the exit strategy that startups will take as these large firms buy and acquire companies. That's huge. That affects startups, and currently those conversations aren't being had about as we think about this, making sure. I think it's important as lawmakers are hearing about this that they have that in the front of their mind. They're like, okay, we have to be careful not to make it more difficult for large companies to acquire startups, because that screws up our whole startup ecosystem landscape. That is an area that any one of you could go and just have a meeting with your local congressional office, with your staffer, and have a phone call, and make probably a big impact. So that's something that I would really encourage you to stay up to date on. The other thing that I think is really interesting here, that I'm interested in sort of an academic standpoint, is what the implications are for App Store development. More and more over the past decade, we've seen the public sector rely on the App Store for innovation as we try to grow startup ecosystems across the country. Probably the largest category of all companies are apps or app-based, sort of, that where an app is critical to the function of the company. And that essentially we have a private corporation, and this is the debate that as it was laid out, is that we have a private company, Apple, that manages the App Store, sets pricing, has essentially unilateral power over its operation, and the implications of that in terms of power and sovereignty are all very big and are all changing. So it's interesting to see lawmakers question and raise a few questions. They didn't really go in depth, but that is going to be one of the biggest questions of our time, I think. is how do we move forward? How do we maintain this? Should the government buy part of Apple? All of these larger questions that I think are going to be discussed in the public sphere in the next couple of years. Anything else on antitrust before I move on? Marketplace regulation, one I didn't really talk about, but how Amazon sets up its store and how that interacts with entrepreneurs. Of course, these big platforms essentially exist to provide a service for small companies, so you all use these. So that's something that's going to be really critical. But it's so big, it doesn't only affect entrepreneurs or startups, it really affects the whole world in a very dramatic way. So that would be hard to miss as well. Privacy security. This is maybe the biggest issue in technology. Aside from antitrust being emerging, but data privacy has been for a long time the largest debate. It's really been the hottest debate in tech policy in DC for a couple of years. We've seen some movement. Of course, CCPA was a huge sort of statute as California's first state to sort of create a privacy framework that modeled after GDPR. It's now being enforced. Jessica, curious about your thoughts on CCPA. How do you encounter it in Dallas?
Yeah, so I think the CCPA is important. And I'm sorry if I interrupted you earlier. I thought you were frozen, not me. The joys of technology. But the CCPA, like Graham said, is the first push in the United States to modernize and streamline consumer-facing privacy regulations. And I think the CCPA has a big impact on Texas businesses, especially because if you're engaged in a technology platform that is crossing state borders, then really I advise clients you need to be compliant with both CalOPA and CCPA as kind of a starting point. Most or a lot of businesses will not reach CCPA enforceability for a certain period of time. There's a threshold in terms of users or active engagement with residents of California to actually be subject to the CCPA requirements. But I find that not every client and not every platform has the ability to track the metrics necessary to effectively determine their CCPA compliance. And so as a matter of default, I think that it's best practice to be CCPA compliant. And because of that, I think you get into a lot of issues that we see similar to GDPR, which is the actual regulation and what you're required to put into consumer-facing disclosures is like the tip of the iceberg, right? It's 10%. The other 90%, the real bulk and kind of burden of those policies are from the structural changes and making sure that you've implemented the security protocols or data storage protocols to be compliant with those sorts of regulations. So I see CCPA being certainly time and cost intensive to implement for smaller businesses, especially those who are going to become CCPA compliant out of default, as opposed, or I find it kind of similar to the levels of burden that it adds for GDPR, but probably a notch down. CCPA is certainly as close as we're going to get to the GDPR in the US for the time being. De facto regulation across the US. I don't think so, at least at this point. We saw with CalOPA too that California has been taking for a while now, certainly the most proactive steps in terms of data and privacy regulation in the United States. And an example, in Texas, we're so far behind when you look at our privacy regulations. We really have skated by in most instances with the bare minimum regulations on this, which I think have been beneficial to the development of technology and business in Texas, but certainly from a regulatory perspective, put us behind our counterparts. I don't anticipate that Texas will adopt anything remotely close to CCPA in the coming future. There's always talk of things that may be presented but I don't see it being a priority. You also have to keep in mind in Texas, we have such short legislative sessions. For those of you that may not be aware, the Texas legislature is not in session every year. And when it is in session, they're very short sessions. So when you think about priorities and things that the legislature will actually have the ability to get to within the legislative session, I don't see any piece of legislation similar to CCPA ever probably getting to that point in the next legislative session.
Texas, my understanding is that Texas is looking at a legislative, is going to review this next year. They have it on the calendar for 2021. And in the meantime, there is a study group tasked with this. And so if you're really interested, if you're somebody like Trey Bowles, who really can speak on behalf of a whole ecosystem, definitely would encourage you to find out more about how to get involved with that study group in Texas. But what we've seen in other states, CCPA is incredibly liberal. And while there is some bipartisan consensus on privacy, there's really not around one really critical aspect of the law, which is, should there be a private right of action? What does that look like? Essentially, should an individual that's non-governmental be able to sue a private company or corporation for a data breach, which currently is not included in any federal law, most state laws, but is a part of CCPA. And I don't know what that looks like, so you have to talk to an attorney about that. And to address some of your questions, I see a lot of very specific sort of categorical, how do these regulations apply to me questions. Those are all questions for an attorney or for, I would really talk to a lawyer, because it's going to be specific to your own platform. It's a fairly nuanced law.
If any of you had questions about the working group that's studying that in Texas, send me an email and I can connect you with individuals that are participating in that. So Trey, I'm sure Jennifer probably has connections, but.
The one thing that, so what we have seen a couple of other states have big privacy battles this year. The most really advanced one was Washington, which had a bill that was killed at the last day of the legislative session because of that specific issue. They couldn't reach agreement on what a private right of action should look like. And so that's going to be, it's going to be hot moving forward. Should CCPA be modeled at the federal level? Maybe that's probably, I mean, it's possible that could be better for entrepreneurs. I don't think that that's clear now. There's not a lot of interest in doing that. I think a federal preempt effort has a lot more political capital behind it, which is the leading effort from industry, kind of ubiquitously across all industry, which is an interesting issue, because this is one where you really just see unanimity among biotech, startups, et cetera. And Jerry Moran, senator from Kansas, introduced a bill that's really being looked at as, so there's like two versions. There's a Democrat and there's a Republican bill. The Republican bill is a little bit more bipartisan. The two debates, there's the private right of action, and there's also sort of data ownership is another one that they're trying to figure out. Data ownership, as it kind of relates to privacy, the state of New York, which is also looking at privacy law, hasn't moved forward with a draft yet. State of New York has also looked at trying to figure out how to create some sort of data ownership, and which would include a data tax. That is, when you hear about things like own your data, that is a movement basically taking place to give individuals the ability to sort of capitalize on their own personal data as companies use it. It's very, very forward thinking. It's not clear that that's possible, but there are a couple of very strong advocates, including Brittany Kaiser, who was part of the Cambridge Analytica thing, who have been extremely active in this advocacy at the state level. And they're also working with other countries, such as the Philippines, to sort of create. So as the thing to be aware of with this legislative strategy is that we don't have as much control of that, I think, in the US. So if we're too slow to move on it, it's possible that things can start developing elsewhere. So something to pay attention to. The Privacy Shield thing, huge. Yes, the European Union just, it's a major decision. Basically struck down that Privacy Shield is no longer valid for folks who host data in the EU. If you use Privacy Shield and you're in the EU, also just very specific question for your lawyers. My understanding is that those contracts with Privacy Shield are still enforceable. So you got to figure out, but that's a very specific question. If you haven't figured out what you're doing there, talk to Jessica or talk to an attorney who can help you. But definitely demonstrates a global trend, I think, toward national control over data policy. And that is something that we're all gonna, I mean, nobody really knows how to navigate. We're all kind of concerned about it. It's gonna be a different world that we live in. And as right now, everyone's just trying to figure out what this is gonna mean for data transfers across borders. So be involved if you're not. But, Jessica, do you have any thoughts on Privacy Shield?
Not really outside of what you already said. I think that I second which contracts being enforceable and being mindful of those things. And if that's something that you think applies to you, I would talk to an attorney sooner rather than later, certainly. But nothing to add in addition to what you have already said on.
Excellent. Two other quick things on privacy. So COPPA, if you have, this is something that affected TikTok. You can remember TikTok got fined by the FTC for COPPA violations a couple years ago. It's the, can't remember what it stands for. Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, I think is what it is.
The federal rules that protect information regarding children, for those of you curious. Too many acronyms in policy.
Another area where we've seen a couple of European entities, the UK recently made some pretty aggressive changes to their privacy regulations as they affect children. And I think that's under 18, not under 16. So that was one big move. So more is coming on that, definitely. The FTC held a workshop last October. Again, if you have questions about specific country, the France thing I'm not very up to date on. Unfortunately, I can't really tell you too much about that. The other privacy thing that happened in the US is really important. There was a major, so Illinois has something called the Biometric Information Protection Act, which has rules about what your terms and conditions need to look like if you use facial recognition or other biometric data. You have to notify people that you're doing it. Facebook was sued by a law firm in Chicago for basically using facial recognition technology to tag people in photos, and they hadn't updated the terms and conditions. They settled in January a $550 million class action lawsuit. It's the largest privacy lawsuit in American history. This is, every Facebook user in Illinois is going to get a couple $100 in their pocket. As we think about biometric information and facial recognition technology, that's really the state law that's going to be looked at and is being looked at right now. That debate has taken a back seat to these other privacy debates regarding CCPA just because it's so politically magnetic. But I think BIPA is going to become a bigger deal sooner than later. And especially as you look at states around Illinois, where Illinois startups are involved, that affects, probably a handful of startups here, but okay, so COPPA we talked about. Let's go down. We got, it was 1235. Okay, so trade real quick. USMCA went into effect. I don't really know the details here. Very basic. What it did for startups is it created a better IP framework that's more advantageous for US startups. Defined a set of digital trade provisions that hadn't previously ever been defined. So that's big, setting a new sort of landscape for digital cooperation in North America. generally seen as a win for small businesses and for trade. Jessica, do you have any other comments on?
Yes, but I will save them because I know you're in your last 9 minutes and I don't want to take a bunch of time. I know you've been trying to respond to questions and we appreciate that. So proceed, and I will save my opinions on that for another day.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so some other stuff. Obviously, the China tariffs, a huge deal, very specific, industry specific. It seems like it's probably going to continue. Not too many updates there. One other thing that people are really thinking about is the COVID, as it affects our global economy, puts pressures on all kinds of new sectors to sort of act in different ways. This is going to have important ramifications down the line. I don't think we're going to see anything soon in the U.S. regarding that. So I think USMCA probably the trade thing we're going to see for the next couple of years. Taxes. Okay, so there have been a couple of state level tax bills that haven't been made law, but have been very problematic politically, and do suggest that we're going to see more challenges for startups being posed. Digital services taxes at the state level are being discussed. That would mean that if you're sort of a platform that operates just in the US, you still need to be cognizant of local frameworks. And that's sort of compounded by a recent court case, South Dakota versus Wayfair, which, and I have listed here, if you really want to get into the weeds here, Engine has good resources available. There's been a bunch of press about this too, but basically businesses are navigating local taxation. My understanding is this makes it so that platforms have or not platforms, but the businesses have the responsibility to be adhering to local tax law.
Yeah, so it gives them the potential. So Wayfair, I think, is kind of a bombshell in terms of tax law and businesses, because e-commerce has traditionally thrived under the protection that if they didn't have a physical premise somewhere, they generally were not subject to the local tax laws. And what Wayfair says is, so what happened is South Dakota, for those of you who may not be familiar, passed a law that said they could collect taxes from these businesses even if they didn't produce, or even if they didn't have a physical presence, that once they passed a threshold of volume of business that they were still subject to the tax laws. And what Wayfair technically says is that like that are allowable at the state level. So I certainly think it's a cause for awareness to watch for what happens in other states, but I don't think it's a cause for panic like it was maybe portrayed in a lot of news events, which was, oh no, now we're subject to every state's tax law in every state that we sell a chair in. And that's really not the tangible takeaway from Wayfair. So certainly talk to someone about that. And if someone wants to talk about Wayfair more, I love talking about Wayfair, so I'd be happy to talk to you about it, but I will not take up the rest of your time, Graham, with specifics on Wayfair.
Thought, which is good. And it wasn't even for this time. So let's talk about AB5. This is
my favorite new topic to talk about.
Little background here: AB5 law passed in California that changed how independent contractors in certain industries must be kept. Most famously, Uber and Lyft drivers now must be classified as employees. It's not, it's been changing a lot on a day-to-day basis. The last thing I heard was that a judge had given a stay to allow Lyft and Uber more time to figure out how they were going to do this before moving forward. Jessica, help me out there.
Yeah, so Uber and Lyft sued the state of California to not have to abide by the rule. And this has, in my opinion, massive impacts. If you are using developers or contractors potentially, or you have members of your team that are located in California, this is kind of catastrophic, honestly. I don't think I'm the only one of the opinion that AB5 was terribly drafted and rushed through in passage without really strongly considering the bigger picture implications. And especially in the startup community and tech community, where we tend to default to wanting to classify everyone as an independent contractor, this really effectively prohibits you from being able to do that with the vast majority of people. There are some notable industry carve-outs. So the entertainment and music industries have received some carve-outs and exceptions. But as a general rule, if you do business or have any sort of team members in California, this AB5 is something I would be very concerned about. And I don't anticipate, just to kind of preempt the question, this or a similar rule taking effect in other states. I think hopefully other states have learned their lesson from this and they won't try to do something similar. There's underlying labor concerns on each side of the aisle, and I understand that, but I think we're all of the consensus AB5 is not the way to solve those concerns on any level.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I do think a couple of other states have begun, but it's Illinois and New York. Illinois and New York have started to figure out if this is something they can do. Very similar to privacy. These sort of are the three major U.S. New York, Chicago, California. These states tend to do things very aggressively, very quickly. I don't think anything's going to pass in either New York or Illinois. There is talk of trying to create some sort of a federal version of this that has gained steam. That might go away with all this pushback, because there's been it's so messy, and I don't think people really who are making the laws understand how these companies operate. And that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah.
Is they're reacting to political pressure that they're getting. They're not making very informed, as a policymaker, I don't think it's a good thing, but that's it's happening. So.
Well, and I anticipate we'll see it addressed at the federal level at some point. That conversation will remain because there has always been and there remains a large discrepancy between the way the federal government and state governments classify employees and independent contractors, the way they're classified for labor purposes and tax purposes. And I think that does currently put a strain on entrepreneurs, because there are varying definitions that people are trying to comply with that are really inefficient. So I anticipate the conversation on the federal level will remain, because there is an underlying discrepancy that needs to be addressed. But I don't think my personal opinion, AB5 is not the way to go about doing it.
Yeah. So we'll see there. It's going to be interesting to see how this works for Uber and Lyft. If they pull out of California, that's one of the big ones that we got to watch. One of those. Okay, a couple other things at the federal level. On the immigration front, these things are very important for entrepreneurs. The DACA conversation's been sort of come on pause for now, thanks to the Supreme Court decision. A lot of DACA recipients stay in the country. Engine did some research to figure out what those numbers are. It was like 2% of all DACA recipients are entrepreneurs. It was a large number, so that's cool. H-1B suspension by the White House. So that is the other thing. Is that the White House issued an executive order. I don't know if it was all H-1Bs. Is it all H-1Bs that they just decided to stop issuing?
I believe so, but I'm not 100% certain on that.
So that big issue, obviously not good for startups. H-1B is already an issue where there is kind of constantly under analysis by lawmakers as they try to make the process more friendly for smaller companies. So that's an issue. Don't just wait for it to become politically hot. If that's something that you're interested in doing advocacy on, you can really make an impact by just keeping an active and sort of constant conversation with the lawmakers. Now, I'm going to say that for all of these issues. If this is something that really impacts your business or an investment that you have or your local economy, and you are interested, do the advocacy. but do it on a regular basis. Build a relationship. Once something really hits the news cycle, it's really hard to make an impact in terms of getting through and not sounding like you're reacting to the political discussion. So that's important. Running out of time. One thing to keep Smart Cities and Communities Act. This is a bill, it's been introduced 3 years in a row, has very low likelihood of moving, but would do a huge amount for small and large technology companies alike. Most importantly, it creates $200 million with funding for workforce development to create implementation. So it would give grants to organizations that do sort of smart city work, and that's very broad. That could generally, the DEC is one, the Dallas Entrepreneurial Center would almost certainly qualify. That funding issued through grants and has specifics about workforce development, so for coding education boot camps, something to smart cities. Okay, so COVID update on funding, PPP. Let's go there next. Republicans next week are discussing in the Senate the COVID relief package. It's gone back and forth. No really predicting what's going to happen there. Jessica, if you have any comments on what your clients are doing here, what you're paying attention to.
I do have a lot of thoughts on this. However, we are likely going to get kicked out of this session room soon because technically our session ended at 11:45. So I want to thank everyone for all the comments. I'm going to give Graham a second to wrap up and just make some closing remarks. I really appreciate the engagement. This is the first time we've done a session like this, so knowing that y'all enjoyed it and that this is something that you have an interest in is really, really helpful and helps us to know about maybe adding more legislative update and some sessions like this in future startup weeks that maybe have more specific focuses and can get into the weeds on some of these topics more. So I really appreciate it. Graham, I'm going to give you a minute or two to just make any closing remarks, and then I will close us out.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you, all of you, for being here. It's great to see entrepreneurs getting into the weeds on this policy stuff, which we just need as much of it as possible. As many of you guys out there doing advocacy on this as possible, being loud, doing the organizing work to get your friends involved. These issues are happening faster than we could ever imagine. The one thing that I didn't get to that I really wanted to was the SEC has made a bunch of very small, more. So the SEC has something called the Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation. Her name is Martha Miller, is this woman, this advocate. She was created by a couple years ago by a law from Congress. They've made so many good changes for startups and small businesses. They're doing it so fast, and they're having very active listening sessions that are extremely accessible. So get involved. So